Welcome back to The Shadows. Before we uncover tonight's archived file, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never get lost in the dark. The heavy manila folder sat quietly on the sharp edge of the rusted steel desk, its fibrous corners curled and deeply stained with decades of accumulated humidity. On the yellowed cover, boldly marked in faded red ink, were the ominous words Unresolved Narrative Inquiry. Incident 84B. The audio recording attached to this leaked police report begins not with a human voice, but with the steady, relentless ticking of an old mechanical clock inside an interrogation room that no longer officially exists. Officer Thomas Vance had spent over 22 grueling years working the quiet, fog-drenched beat of the Pacific Northwest, a vast region where the dense pine canopy swallowed the natural sunlight long before dusk ever settled over the mountains. He was a practical man grounded entirely in the tangible reality of physical evidence: fresh footprints, deep tire marks, and cold bullet casings. Yet, the confidential document laying directly in front of him contained none of those clean, logical elements. Instead, it meticulously detailed the final, horrifying week of Jonathan Reynolds, an isolated highway surveyor whose routine assignment quickly turned into something that pushed the boundaries of standard law enforcement protocol into pure, inescapable psychological horror. It was mid-October when Jonathan was officially assigned to map the newly proposed highway expansion route near Blackwood Basin, a desolate stretch of federal timberland that had been strictly closed to the general public since the late 1970s. The official government reasoning cited unstable terrain and hazardous, abandoned timber mines, but local law enforcement discreetly kept a separate, unofficial filing drawer for the bizarre calls that occasionally came out of those deep woods. Jonathan was young, ambitious, and utterly unbothered by the profound isolation of the wilderness. His professional gear consisted of a standard land surveying kit, a heavy portable radio unit, a battery-powered lantern, and an Olympus audio tape recorder he routinely used to dictate his daily topographic findings. On his very first afternoon in the field, the local weather held a crisp, unnerving stillness. The thick air smelled heavily of damp earth, decaying pine needles, and an underlying, faint metallic tang that he initially attributed to exposed iron deposits hidden deep within the dark soil. He carefully set up his primary base camp in a long-disused ranger station originally built in the early 1940s, a solitary, weathered wooden structure featuring board-backed windows and a heavy, solid timber door. The first formal audio entry on his tape recorder was completely mundane, dutifully detailing slight elevation changes, dense tree-line measurements, and the unusual total lack of wildlife noises throughout the basin. Jonathan explicitly noted that throughout his exhausting 8-hour walk along the perimeter, he had not heard a single bird call, a chattering squirrel, or even the faint buzz of an insect. The oppressive silence was absolute, pressing hard against his eardrums like a heavy physical weight. As dusk arrived, bringing with it a thick, creeping mist that rolled steadily down from the surrounding rocky ridges, Jonathan retired inside the safety of the cabin. He lit his brass lantern, boiled water on a small propane camp stove, and prepared to log his evening field notes into the official journal. That was precisely when the first severe anomaly occurred. At 11:14 p.m., according to the official timestamp preserved on the police transcript, Jonathan's microphone caught a low, rhythmic thudding echoing from directly beneath the wooden floorboards. It was certainly not the natural settling of an aging foundation, nor was it the scurrying of wild rodents in the dark. It sounded remarkably like a deliberate, measured impact, repeating every 4 seconds with terrifying mechanical precision. On the master tape, Jonathan can be clearly heard stopping his dictation mid-sentence, his breathing suddenly becoming shallow, ragged, and fast. He slowly lowered the omnidirectional microphone down toward the cold ground, capturing 30 agonizing seconds of the muffled, persistent pounding. Driven by a volatile mixture of professional frustration and rapidly mounting personal anxiety, he firmly picked up his heavy metal flashlight, unlocked the iron latch on the basement hatch in the far corner of the room, and slowly began his ominous descent into the absolute darkness below. The forgotten basement beneath the old ranger station was certainly never meant to be a living space. It was a rough-hewn stone cellar carved directly into the cold granite bed of the ancient mountain. As Jonathan slowly descended the squeaking, unstable wooden stairs, the surrounding air turned noticeably colder with every downward step, carrying a thick, suffocating odor of stale water, mold, and undisturbed dust. He swept the bright beam of his flashlight across the low ceiling, highlighting heavy cedar beams that were remarkably free of any cobwebs. In fact, just as in the silent forest above, there were absolutely no signs of organic life down here. No spiders, no crawling insects, nothing that moved or breathed in the shadows. The low pounding sound had instantly stopped the exact moment his heavy boot touched the gravel floor, leaving behind a heavy, expectant silence that made his own rapid heartbeat sound like thunder in his ears. He walked slowly toward the back wall of the cellar, where the sweeping flashlight beam caught something completely unexpected. A massive iron door set directly into the solid rock face, entirely out of place for a simple forestry outpost. The heavy door was secured with 3 massive iron latch bars, but bizarrely, none of them were engaged or locked in place. They had been intentionally pulled back by someone, left hanging loosely open by mere centimeters. Jonathan hesitated in the cold darkness, his fingers trembling slightly as he brought the digital recorder close to his dry lips. He murmured a quick, quiet note about the disturbing discovery, his hesitant voice barely above a whisper, echoing faintly off the damp stone walls. Curiosity, combined with a strict professional urge to document every anomaly, completely overpowered his instinct to turn back and flee. He reached out, placed his gloved hand against the ice-cold iron surface, and gently pushed it open. The heavy door groaned loudly on rusted hinges, opening into a long, narrow tunnel that sloped gradually downward into the absolute dark of the earth. Unlike the rough cellar, this hidden passage showed clear, unmistakable signs of recent human activity. Fresh wooden structural supports lined the earthen walls, and the damp dirt floor bore clear, distinct impressions of deep boot prints, all leading steadily deeper into the dark, but telling none returned back toward the cellar stairs. Jonathan shone his light into the vast abyss, completely unable to see where the subterranean corridor ended. As he prepared to step back into the cellar and lock the iron door firmly behind him, a faint sound drifted up from the quiet depths of the tunnel. It was definitely not a mechanical thump this time. It was the faint, unmistakable sound of a calm human voice reciting a monotonous string of random, 5-digit numbers in a flat, completely emotionless tone. The voice sounded eerily, chillingly familiar, carrying a specific cadence and inflection that instantly froze the blood in Jonathan's veins. It sounded almost identical to his own voice. Overwhelming panic took complete hold of his mind immediately. Jonathan scrambled frantically back up the wooden stairs, slamming the heavy hatch shut and dragging a solid oak table over the wooden door to tightly secure it from above. He sat isolated in the center of the dark cabin with his back pressed firmly against the far wall, his knuckles white as his hands tightly gripped a heavy iron fire poker. His wide eyes remained utterly locked on the vibrating floorboards until the cold, gray light of morning finally filtered through the narrow cracks in the window boards. When he finally checked his equipment at sunrise, he made a truly horrifying discovery. His primary tape recorder had continued running throughout the entire night. When he rewound the spool and pressed play, he heard the clear audio of his own heavy breathing and deep sleep, accompanied continuously by the sound of a gentle, rhythmic knocking coming from the inside of his cabin's locked front door, continuing completely unbroken until dawn. The rising sun brought no genuine warmth to Blackwood Basin, only a pale, milky light that struggled bitterly to penetrate the dense, suffocating pine canopy overhead. Inside the cold ranger station, Jonathan Reynolds sat motionless near the barred window, the heavy battery-powered tape recorder resting quietly on his knees. His eyes were deeply red-rimmed from absolute exhaustion, fixed intently on the iron hatch leading down to the cellar. The heavy oak table he had dragged over the opening remained completely undisturbed, yet the unbearable psychological weight of the horrifying night had fundamentally altered his perception of the physical space around him. Every subtle creak of the aging timber frame felt amplified tenfold, instantly translating into a terrifying potential threat in his mind. He replayed the shocking morning discovery repeatedly in his thoughts, the seamless recording of his own sleeping breath layered directly over the persistent, rhythmic knocking at the heavy wooden front door. It was a terrifying impossibility that violated all basic logic, suggesting either a sophisticated technological manipulation or an entity that possessed an unnatural, intimate familiarity with his presence. Attempting to regain full control over his failing faculties, Jonathan initiated a fresh audio recording session. Keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will, he spoke directly into the small microphone, detailing every single event of the preceding night for the official log. He carefully cited the precise timestamps from the digital counter, noting the unsettling discrepancy between his physical recollection of silence inside the cabin and the frantic audio captured by the sensitive diaphragm. He desperately reasoned that the extreme atmospheric pressure changes within the isolated basin might be affecting the electrical equipment, causing strange signal bleed or audio feedback from unknown nearby frequencies. Yet, even as he articulated these logical rationales out loud, his gaze continuously wandered back to his topological maps spread widely across the rusted desk. Marked in dark red ink were several geological anomalies he had cataloged during his first 2 days. Strange linear depressions in the damp soil that formed unnatural geometric patterns extending outward from the ranger station. Driven by a desperate necessity to gather objective physical evidence before attempting to report to his supervisors via the shortwave radio, Jonathan decided to venture outside to inspect the entire exterior perimeter of the cabin. He systematically loaded his heavy leather tool bag with fresh cassette tapes, spare alkaline batteries, a solid steel crowbar, and his high-intensity halogen flashlight. As he carefully stepped across the threshold onto the damp wooden porch, the immediate environment felt noticeably, unnervingly altered. The crisp morning air carried an intense concentration of ozone and scorched earth, a sharp, chemical smell that deeply irritated his respiratory tract. Upon examining the heavy oak front door from the outside, his blood instantly ran cold. The exterior would show no direct physical damage, no deep scratches, dents, or tool marks. Yet the fine layer of pine pollen and dust that covered the lower panels had been meticulously wiped clean in a series of sweeping, arch-like patterns, as if something soft had brushed against the wood continuously for hours in the dark. Walking slowly along the rough stone foundation of the structure, Jonathan carefully examined the damp soil where the ground met the cabin's base. There were no human footprints, no animal tracks, and absolutely no signs of mechanical disturbance. However, he uncovered a distinct, chilling series of shallow depressions running strictly parallel to the building, spaced at exact 4-inch intervals. They matched the rhythmic cadence of the pounding sound he had recorded beneath the floorboards the previous night with terrifying accuracy. Following these bizarre depressions away from the main cabin, Jonathan discovered that they led directly toward the dense eastern treeline, where the forest dipped sharply into a heavily shadowed, fog-drenched ravine. The density of the dark vegetation increased significantly along this narrow path, blocking out even the meager daylight. As he stood trembling at the very edge of the steep slope, his portable radio suddenly cracked wildly to life, bursting with loud static before settling into a clear, steady broadcast of an indistinct, rhythmic humming noise. Jonathan unclipped the heavy portable radio from his leather work belt, his thumb instinctively adjusting the frequency dial in an urgent attempt to isolate the absolute source of the unnatural transmission. Despite his efforts, The signal remained unerringly rock-solid across multiple channels, exhibiting an unnatural, mechanical consistency that clearly indicated a high-powered transmitter operating in extremely close proximity to his location. The sound that emitted from the small, scratched speaker was certainly not random atmospheric static. It was a calibrated acoustic loop consisting of two distinct, haunting tones alternating with mathematical precision every 3 seconds. As he stood frozen in the damp evening air, listening intently to the relentless pulse, the ambient forest noise around him seemed to diminish entirely. The rustling leaves, the distant wind, and the evening birds all faded away, quickly replaced by a suffocating heavy silence that made the synthetic broadcast feel overwhelmingly dominant in the deep woods. He carefully brought his digital audio recorder closer to the radio speaker, capturing several uninterrupted minutes of the eerie signal while taking meticulous, handwritten notes regarding the raw signal strength and peculiar modulation patterns. His rigorous professional training as a senior surveyor strictly mandated that he document every single anomaly without exception, yet his most primal survival instincts urged him to immediately pack his gear and retreat toward the safety of the main highway. Deciding after a long moment of hesitation that his primary professional responsibility was to establish direct contact with the district forestry office, Jonathan slowly returned to the cabin to utilize the main shortwave console. The radio unit was a heavy, older vacuum tube model mounted permanently to the sturdy wooden wall, powered directly by a dedicated lead-acid battery array in the corner. He flipped the heavy toggle power switch, watching the faint amber indicator bulbs flicker uncertainly to life as the vacuum tubes gradually warmed up in the dim light. He grabbed the cold plastic microphone, carefully set the frequency dial to the official emergency forestry band, and broadcast his call sign clearly into the receiver. He repeated the urgent distress call 3 times in a calm, steady voice, pausing after each attempt to listen intently through the quiet room for any sign of a response. Instead of the familiar, comforting voice of the dispatcher at the regional office, the speaker suddenly produced a sharp, ear-splitting burst of static interference, followed immediately by the identical, haunting alternating tones he had just recorded outside in the ravine. A deep, cold sense of dread settled heavily over the dark cabin as Jonathan realized with absolute certainty that the shortwave system was completely saturated and overridden by the powerful local signal. He frantically attempted to adjust the manual frequency knob back and forth across the dial, but every single channel yielded the exact same horrifying result. The continuous, hypnotic two-tone transmission repeating endlessly through the small room. Suddenly, without any warning, the audio stream cut off completely, replaced by a sudden, jarring burst of startlingly clear audio. It was unmistakably a recorded telephone call, accompanied by the distinct, vintage crackle of an ancient analog landline connection. The voice echoing on the recording was remarkably crisp and cold, speaking with an impersonal, clinical cadence that sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. It was a man's voice, completely devoid of emotion, methodically reading a long series of precise geographical coordinates, followed immediately by a dense list of full names and specific dates ranging all the way from 1952 up to the present year. Jonathan listened intently to every word, his trembling pen hovering directly over his logbook as he desperately transcribed the incoming information into the lined pages. As the cold voice continued its methodical reading through the radio speaker, Jonathan's hand suddenly froze mid-word on the paper. The narrator pronounced a date that precisely matched the current calendar day, October 14th, followed immediately by his own full legal name and his official employee identification number. Before he could even begin to process the terrifying implications of the broadcast, the radio speaker emitted a piercing, high-frequency squeal that violently forced him to drop the microphone onto the floor. Simultaneously, the heavy oak table positioned directly over the dark cellar hatch began to slide slowly across the dusty wooden floorboards, pushed forcibly from below by a deliberate, incremental force. The iron hatch latch creaked and groaned under the immense mounting pressure, slowly rising millimeter by millimeter as an extremely low, resonant frequency vibrated through the structural timber beams of the cabin, threatening to completely shatter the remaining window glass. The sudden, Grinding sound of the heavy oak table sliding violently across the dusty floorboards vibrated through the rubber soles of Jonathan's boots, accompanied by a low-frequency, subterranean hum that set his teeth on edge. The cold iron latch of the cellar hatch continued to rise steadily, strained against its ancient hinges by an unyielding, irresistible pressure pushing directly from below. Absolute desperation taking complete hold of his mind, Jonathan frantically grabbed the heavy steel crowbar from his open tool kit and jammed it horizontally beneath the iron handle, bracing it firmly against the solid timber frame of the doorway. The sudden physical resistance caused the wooden hatch to groan loudly under the mounting tension, but the upward movement temporarily ceased. Standing directly atop the cellar door to add his own body weight, Jonathan held his breath in total terror, listening intently through the oppressive gloom. Below his trembling feet, the sound of rhythmic thudding suddenly shifted into a frantic, wet scraping noise, like desperate fingernails dragging relentlessly across rough, wet granite. The heavy shortwave radio console behind him suddenly erupted into another sharp, ear-splitting burst of static, abruptly breaking the hypnotic two-tone transmission that had dominated the airwaves. The clinical, automated male voice returned to the speaker, but this time it was no longer reciting cold geographical coordinates or historical lists of names and dates. Instead, it was terrifyingly playing back an audio file recorded only 30 minutes prior, the exact sound of Jonathan's own heavy footsteps walking around the exterior stone foundation of the ranger station. Every crunch of dry pine needles, every heavy boot fall on the damp earth was broadcast back to him in perfect, crystal-clear audio fidelity. The horrifying realization struck him with sickening, paralyzing force. He was not merely being quietly observed from afar. Every single physical action he took was being actively monitored, recorded, and retransmitted in real time by an unknown subterranean apparatus operating directly beneath Blackwood Basin. Knowing with absolute certainty that remaining trapped inside the small wooden cabin was a slow, inevitable sentence of psychological isolation, Jonathan made a swift, calculated decision. He tightly grabbed his high-intensity halogen flashlight, quickly checked the fresh cassette tape inside his Olympus recorder, and firmly secured the steel crowbar back into his leather belt loop. If the terrifying entity or mysterious broadcast network operating in Blackwood Basin was truly centered within the vast cavernous system below, he urgently needed to locate the physical broadcast source to understand precisely what he was dealing with. He kicked the heavy table away from the hatch, pulled the cold iron lever back, and hoisted the massive wooden door open. The thick, icy air from the deep cellar rushed upward into the room, carrying with it that familiar, intense smell of ozone, scorched earth, and stagnant, ancient water. Descending the squeaking stone stairs once more, Jonathan completely bypassed the outer cellar area and stepped straight into the narrow, iron-doored tunnel he had discovered the previous night. The dark passage sloped downward at a sharp, unnatural 20-degree incline, its raw dirt walls reinforced by modern steel beams that contrasted sharply with the rustic timber construction above. The earthen floor was slick with moisture, marked by continuous, deep mechanical grooves where heavy technical equipment had clearly been dragged into the depths over the years. As he navigated deeper into the mountain's heart, the ambient temperature plummeted rapidly, instantly freezing his shallow breath into pale white clouds before the bright halogen flashlight beam. After roughly 200 yards of tense progression, the cramped tunnel opened abruptly into a massive artificial subterranean chamber. A forgotten Cold War-era vault lined with towering rows of silent server racks and massive reels of magnetic recording tape that were slowly, automatically spinning in the pitch dark. The sheer, monumental scale of the underground facility was utterly staggering. Towering metal server racks stretched far into the cold gloom, lit only by the faint, rhythmic blinking of amber and green indicator LEDs. The air inside the vast subterranean chamber was crisp, dry, and continuously swept by a low, vibrating hum from concealed ventilation units built directly into the cavernous rock ceiling above. Jonathan walked slowly down the long central aisle, his sweeping halogen flashlight beam catching decades of accumulated dust on the abandoned steel consoles. This was clearly not a natural occurrence or an isolated paranormal haunt. It was a highly sophisticated, military-grade intelligence outpost that had been abandoned, or perhaps intentionally left operating on automated protocols for over 40 long years. Yet, despite the apparent age of the rusted hardware, the massive magnetic tape reels were actively turning in the dark, feeding endless spools of tape through massive analog sound decks with terrifying mechanical precision. As Jonathan approached the primary control console situated at the very center of the vault, he noticed a thick leather ledger sitting beside a bank of dusty microphone inputs. The faded cover bore the exact same markings as the leaked file locked away in the police archive. Project 84B, Acoustic Resonance and Behavioral Mapping. Panning his flashlight across the yellowed pages, he carefully read through detailed entries dating all the way back to 1978. The classified project had been originally designed to utilize ultra-low-frequency acoustic waves to map and manipulate human cognitive responses in conditions of extreme geographic isolation. The automated broadcasts, the hypnotic two-tone signals, the methodical reading of geographical coordinates, and the clinical recorded voices were all part of a self-contained feedback system engineered to mimic, record, and psychologically disorient anyone who dared enter the perimeter of Blackwood Basin. However, as he turned to the final pages of the official ledger, the neat, typed logs gave way to chaotic, frantic handwritten scrawls dated just 3 short weeks prior. The last lead researcher had written frantically about an unexpected, catastrophic system anomaly. The automated system had mysteriously begun generating precise audio profiles of individuals who had never officially entered the facility or signed security clearances. The subterranean apparatus was no longer merely playing back pre-recorded sounds. It was actively anticipating human presence, harvesting subtle environmental audio from the surface, and constructing flawless vocal clones using a self-sustaining signal loop buried deep within the mountain's bedrock. The absolute last entry on the page was a single, disturbing sentence written in shaky, smeared black ink. It doesn't just record the living, it summons them. A sudden, deafening mechanical click echoed violently through the vast vault, followed immediately by the heavy whirring of electric motors as all 30 tape decks simultaneously engaged at once. The massive array of floor-to-ceiling speakers surrounding the central platform hummed aggressively to life, filling the subterranean space with a deafening, suffocating wall of sound. It was certainly not random static or simple signal tones this time. It was the perfectly synchronized, multi-layered voices of dozens of different people, all speaking in identical, emotionless unison, reading off Jonathan's exact current heart rate, his precise physical location inside the vault, and the exact remaining battery percentage of his portable flashlight. Then, from the far, pitch-black end of the chamber, where the rows of server racks finally ended against the raw granite wall, Jonathan heard the heavy, rhythmic sound of boot steps walking slowly toward him, stepping in perfect, terrifying synchronization with the pounding of his own frantic heartbeat. The oppressive, suffocating weight of the subterranean vault seemed to compress the very air inside Jonathan's lungs as the heavy footsteps drew near. Each rhythmic thud against the damp concrete floor echoed through the vast space, moving with a deliberate, agonizing slowness that mirrored his own erratic pulse. Jonathan stood frozen beneath the dull amber glow of the main console screens, his high-intensity halogen flashlight beam trembling noticeably as he cut through the surrounding shadows. The wall of synthesized voices pouring aggressively from the audio array suddenly shifted tone, transitioning from a cold, analytical recitation of his vital signs into an eerie, layered murmur that sounded like a congregation whispering in an empty cathedral. The ultra-low frequencies vibrated through the heavy steel framework of the server racks, causing loose screws and metal casings to rattle in perfect harmony with the sound. Sweeping the bright halogen flashlight beam directly toward the source of the footsteps, Jonathan expected to reveal a physical intruder, an operative, or perhaps a lingering survivor of the forgotten facility. Instead, the intense cone of white light revealed nothing but empty air and swirling particles of decades-old dust. Yet, The heavy sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct with every passing second. The damp floor near the far wall showed visible, chilling indentations forming in the fine sediment, as if an invisible weight were pressing down into the dirt step by deliberate step. Jonathan raised his portable audio recorder, forcing his trembling hands to remain steady as the device captured the undeniable acoustic signature of an unseen entity moving without a physical form, surrounded by the sharp crackle of localized electromagnetic interference. Panicked, Jonathan took a sharp step backward, his boot catching the base of a heavy cable conduit. He stumbled hard against the main operational desk, accidentally striking a heavy mechanical switch clearly labeled manual override/archive dump. Instantly, a complex series of pneumatic relays fired with a loud, violent hiss, sending a massive jolt of power through the primary magnetic tape transport system. Deep within the banks of server racks, dozens of large glass reels began to spin backward at high speed, high-pitched whines filling the subterranean room as kilometers of analog tape rewound simultaneously in the gloom. The synchronized, layered voices cut out abruptly, replaced by a single, solitary audio stream that began to play clearly over the main central monitor speakers. It was an audio log recorded decades prior, officially dated November 12, 1982. The voice belonged to Dr. Marcus Vance, the lead acoustic engineer originally assigned to oversee Project 84B. His voice was ragged and desperate, breathing heavily through an oxygen mask as he spoke urgently into a handheld microphone. "The resonance field has achieved critical density," Vance whispered frantically on the master tape, his trembling words punctuated by the same wet, scraping noises Jonathan had heard beneath the wooden floorboards of the ranger station. "It is no longer reflecting our signals. It is actively generating its own intent. The acoustic frequency has anchored itself permanently to the physical geology of the entire basin. Anyone who hears the transmission becomes an integral part of the recording loop. If you are listening to this tape, you are already locked into the signal." Jonathan stared in absolute disbelief at the continuously spinning reels of the central tape deck as Dr. Vance's haunting recorded confession echoed through the freezing subterranean cavern. A cold, bitter sweat broke out across his forehead, despite the rapidly dropping ambient temperature. The horrifying psychological implications of the ancient transcript were utterly monstrous. Project 84B had not merely built a sophisticated automated surveillance system. It had inadvertently tapped into, or perhaps awakened, an acoustic anomaly embedded deep within the granite bedrock of Blackwood Basin. The vast facility was not broadcasting outward to an external audience. It was perpetually feeding a self-sustaining entity that actively consumed audio data, converting human voices, frantic footsteps, and sheer terror into a permanent, localized feedback loop that sought to endlessly expand its physical boundaries. Suddenly, the continuous backward rewind of the massive tape deck halted abruptly with a violent metallic clack. The heavy central magnetic head engaged with a sharp hiss, and a fresh stream of clear audio began to play directly through the console monitors. It was definitely not a historical audio log from 1982. It was a remarkably clear, high-fidelity recording of Jonathan's own voice, recorded only moments ago when he had first stepped into the subterranean vault. On the magnetic tape, he could distinctly hear his own shallow breathing, the crisp click of his halogen flashlight switch, and his own muttered, whispered exclamations of terror. But as the audio recording progressed, a terrifying extra element emerged on the track. A subtle overlay of a second voice whispering directly behind him on the tape, uttering distinct words he knew he had never spoken aloud. "Look directly behind the main server array." Driven by a volatile, terrifying mixture of overwhelming dread and an absolute necessity for real answers, Jonathan turned his body slowly in the gloom, tightly gripping his heavy steel crowbar in his right hand while sweeping his halogen flashlight beam across the towering metal structures. Behind the primary cluster of server racks, tucked far away in the darkest corner of the natural granite wall, sat a small, dusty glass-walled observation booth. The thick safety glass was spider-webbed with old cracks and covered in decades of thick grime, but as Jonathan cautiously approached the booth, His sweeping light beam illuminated something slumped motionless inside a rusted swivel chair facing the silent control panels. It was a dried, mummified human corpse wearing the faded, dust-covered uniform of a 1980s forestry officer. Its skeletal head tilted sharply back toward the rock ceiling, holding a small microcassette recorder glued tightly to its bare-bone fingers. As Jonathan stepped closer to the cracked glass partition, the heavy shortwave radio strapped to his chest suddenly burst into a deafening, ear-splitting wall of static interference. The small microcassette recorder held tightly by the decades-old mummified corpse suddenly clicked to life on its own accord, its internal motor turning slowly and methodically despite the complete absence of a viable power source. From the tiny, tinny speaker of the dead officer's ancient recorder came a startlingly clear, modern voice that instantly made Jonathan's blood run cold in his veins. It was unmistakably his own voice, speaking in a completely flat, emotionless tone, predicting his immediate physical action. Jonathan steps closer to the glass partition, utterly unaware that the heavy vault door behind him has already locked. A sharp, violent metallic slam instantly echoed through the cavernous subterranean chamber as the massive vault door crashed shut, permanently sealing him inside the absolute pitch dark. The air inside the glass observation booth felt unnaturally heavy, saturated with the faint metallic tang of copper and ozone. Sealed behind the thick glass partition, Jonathan Reynolds gripped the steel crowbar, his knuckles white with strain. The automated locks had fallen into place with a dry, heavy mechanical thud that echoed off the granite cavern walls. Outside, the vast vault remained locked in cold subterranean silence, save for the low, rhythmic hum of 30 magnetic tape decks spinning simultaneously. On the rusted desk inside the booth, the microcassette recorder held by the mummified remains of the forestry officer continued to spin its tiny, spooled ribbon. The voice issuing from its tiny speaker was unmistakably Jonathan's own, reciting actions he had not yet taken with a calm, methodical cadence that chilled him to his core. Desperation forced Jonathan to act. He raised the crowbar and struck the reinforced glass of the observation booth with all his strength. The impact produced a dull, hollow thud that reverberated through his arms, leaving nothing more than a tiny white spiderweb mark on the laminated pane. He struck it again, harder this time, but the sound was immediately absorbed by the surrounding architecture, drowned out by a sudden resurgence of low-frequency static over the booth's intercom system. The audio loop was escalating, feeding on his frantic movements. Every blow of the crowbar against the window was recorded, processed, and instantly retransmitted through the overhead speakers, pitched down until it sounded like the rhythmic beating of an enormous mechanical heart deep within the earth. Recognizing that brute force was useless, Jonathan turned his attention to the rusted console desk inside the booth. Amidst scattered logbooks, faded schematics, and empty cassette cases, his flashlight beam illuminated in yellowed, plastic-bound documents stamped with the words Emergency Severance Protocol. Operation 84B. He flipped through the brittle pages with trembling fingers. The document detailed the emergency measures designed by the original research team when they realized the acoustic phenomenon could not be contained by physical barriers. According to the manual, the entity operating within Blackwood Basin was an acoustic parasite, a self-sustaining resonant loop that anchored itself to electronic recording equipment, using human vocal patterns to construct an endless, expanding feedback cycle. The manual stated that the only way to interrupt the loop was to introduce an unrecorded, absolute silence directly into the main mixing node, effectively breaking the feedback chain. However, the document included a severe warning. The main mixing node was located behind the central server array, the very area where the entity had manifested its physical wait moments before. As Jonathan read the final instructions, the shortwave radio strapped to his chest burst into life once more. The voice on the speaker was no longer playing back his past actions. It began to whisper a precise countdown, marking the seconds remaining before the vault's automated ventilation system flushed the remaining oxygen from the room to preserve the delicate magnetic tapes. The rhythmic, synthetic countdown issuing continuously from the shortwave radio speaker echoed ominously through the cramped glass booth, a cold, automated voice systematically ticking down from 60 seconds. The thin air inside the sealed room was already growing noticeably colder and sparser, making Jonathan's frantic lungs ache terribly as he desperately drew deep, ragged breaths of stale oxygen. He knew with absolute certainty that he had less than a single minute to execute the severance protocol before the facility's automated systems flushed the remaining air and suffocated him entirely in the dark. Glancing fearfully at the mummified figure slumped in the swivel chair, Jonathan noticed a heavy brass key hanging from a weathered, cracked leather lanyard coiled around the dead forestry officer's withered neck. Beneath the rusted metal desk, almost completely hidden by decades of accumulated dust, spiderwebs, and fallen electrical cables, sat a heavy, locked steel junction box boldly labeled Master Signal Override. Ignoring the creeping dread that made his trembling hands shake uncontrollably, Jonathan reached over the cold corpse and carefully lifted the heavy brass key from the officer's withered collarbone. The brittle, dried skin tore slightly with a sharp, papery sound that was instantly captured by the omnidirectional microphone of his running Olympus recorder. He immediately dropped down to his knees on the cold floor, jammed the ancient brass key straight into the rusted keyway of the junction box, and turned it hard to the right with all his remaining strength. The mechanical lock turned with a sharp, echoing metallic click, and the heavy steel door swung open on stiff hinges to reveal a complex internal matrix of thick copper patch cables, glowing glass vacuum tubes, and a single, heavy red toggle switch clearly labeled primary ground cut. According to the emergency operational manual, flipping the red toggle switch would temporarily sever the primary ground connection, instantly dropping the operating voltage across all 30 magnetic sound heads in the vast vault to absolute zero. This sudden power drop would create a brief, highly critical 3-second window of total signal vacuum, a complete break in the self-sustaining audio loop long enough to permanently collapse the parasitic acoustic resonance field. But just as Jonathan reached his trembling hand out toward the red switch, the heavy vault door outside the glass booth suddenly began to vibrate violently. The unseen, terrifying entity that had stalked him throughout the subterranean facility was now pressing its immense physical weight directly against the glass from the outside. The thick, reinforced safety pane cracked even further under the sudden mounting pressure, long spiderweb fractures rapidly spreading across the glass surface like sudden frost crawling across a winter window pane. With only 10 seconds remaining on the radio's mechanical countdown and the cracking glass ceiling of the booth visibly bowing inward under the immense, crushing pressure from above, Jonathan violently slammed the palm of his hand down against the red toggle switch. Instantly, every single indicator light in the vast subterranean vault extinguished at once, plunging the entire underground world into absolute, suffocating darkness. The oppressive low hum of the 30 spinning tape decks completely died away, instantly replaced by an absolute, terrifying silence that pressed hard against his throbbing eardrums like a physical mass. For 3 agonizing, interminable seconds, nothing moved, nothing breathed, and not a single sound existed within the deep, subterranean granite bedrock of Blackwood Basin. Then, accompanied by a sudden, loud pneumatic hiss of releasing pressure, the heavy magnetic locks on the observation booth door completely disengaged, slowly swinging the door open into the dark, silent, and unknown vault beyond. The heavy, suffocating silence that immediately followed the sudden power shutdown was absolute, pressing hard against Jonathan's eardrums like an overwhelming underwater weight. Standing just inside the newly opened glass observation booth, he slowly swung the intense beam of his halogen flashlight across the central cavern. The once spinning magnetic tape decks were now locked in complete stasis, their massive glass reels faintly reflecting the cold, sharp beam of white light. Yet, despite the total failure of the subterranean facility's main electrical power grid, a faint amber pulse suddenly began to glow deep within the natural rock wall directly behind the server arrays. It was clearly not powered by copper wires, circuit breakers, or vacuum tubes. The physical geology itself was releasing a faint, bioluminescent resonance, charging the damp mountain air with an intense electrostatic energy. The emergency severance protocol had successfully broken the immediate signal loop, but the fundamental acoustic distortion deeply buried within Blackwood Basin remained entirely untamed. Jonathan moved with extreme caution through the darkened vault, carefully stepping over severed electrical cables and scattered, tangled magnetic tape spools. His primary goal was undeniably simple: reach the main egress access tunnel and escape to the forest surface before the subterranean atmospheric pressure destabilized any further. However, as he passed the central control console in the gloom, his heavy boots struck a solid metal storage trunk that had been dislodged when the pneumatic vault locks violently collapsed. The heavy lid was sprung open, revealing a meticulously cataloged series of leather-bound files marked Department of Defense Operation 84B field depositions. Taped directly to the top historical document was a small, high-density digital storage drive, an anomalous, surprisingly modern addition to an otherwise forgotten Cold War-era archive. Driven by an absolute, desperate necessity to secure physical evidence of the illegal operation before escaping, Jonathan quickly shoved the digital storage drive and the primary field ledger into his leather work bag. But as he turned his body back toward the dark egress tunnel, the portable shortwave radio strapped to his belt emitted a sharp, single metallic click. It did not play atmospheric static, nor did it broadcast the hypnotic two-tone transmission this time. Instead, a strikingly clear, unamplified human voice spoke directly from the deep shadows at the far end of the exit corridor. It was certainly not a synthesized audio clone or a pre-recorded playback. It was unmistakably the voice of Senior Officer Thomas Vance, the very investigator whose voice had originally detailed the confidential file on the leaked police report. "Jonathan," the calm voice echoed softly through the dark stone passage. "You were never meant to survey Blackwood Basin. You were sent here to complete the recording." A cold, paralyzing terror, far more profound than any fear he had experienced throughout the grueling night, instantly seized Jonathan's limbs. The horrifying realization crystallized with devastating clarity. The entire routine land surveying assignment had been a carefully orchestrated setup by the department all along. The local law enforcement agency had not been investigating the terrifying anomalies of Blackwood Basin from a safe distance. They were actively feeding fresh human subjects into the acoustic anomaly to keep the localized containment field stable. Every single step he had taken, every audio recording he had made on his Olympus recorder, was part of a calibrated, monstrous ritual designed to maintain the acoustic resonance loop for another decade. Looking down at the running tape deck on his leather belt, Jonathan saw the bright red recording light flashing steadily in the dark, drawing its operational power directly from the ambient energy of the cavernous granite wall. The steep, dark incline of the narrow exit tunnel felt agonizingly interminable, a suffocating slope of damp earth and raw granite that seemed to stretch endlessly upward into the absolute blackness of the mountain. Jonathan ran for his life, his heavy leather boots slamming violently against the slick rock floor, his frantic lungs burning with every jagged breath of cold, stale mountain air he dragged into his chest. Behind him, the deep subterranean vault began to groan loudly under mounting, unnatural tectonic pressure. The brief, fragile silence that had immediately followed the emergency signal cut was now rapidly collapsing, violently replaced by a massive, ultra-low frequency roar that physically vibrated through the solid stone foundation of the entire mountain range. The acoustic parasite was actively pursuing its missing piece, desperately hunting for the final audio track required to permanently seal the decade-long feedback cycle. The recorded sound of Jonathan's ultimate, violent physical demise inside the desolate depths of Blackwood Basin. Breaking frantically through the iron cellar doors of the abandoned ranger station, Jonathan burst out into the pale, misty light of early morning. The surrounding forest was entirely silent, wrapped tightly in the exact same unnerving, unnatural stillness that had first greeted his arrival days prior. He scrambled wildly out of the cabin's deteriorating wooden doorway, completely ignoring his abandoned surveying equipment scattered on the porch, and raced toward his utility truck parked at the muddy edge of the dirt road. Dragging the rusted, heavy driver's side door open, he threw his leather work bag onto the passenger seat, jammed the ignition key into the slot, and flooded the engine with gas. The cold motor sputtered uncertainly, finally caught with a loud roar, and Jonathan slammed the vehicle into gear, tearing recklessly down the narrow, winding mountain path as the dense timber canopy overhead swayed wildly above him without a single breath of wind. He drove frantically for 3 straight hours without stopping for a single second, steadfastly refusing to look into his rearview mirror until the dense, suffocating pine trees of Blackwood Basin were finally replaced by the familiar asphalt roads and flickering streetlights of the county seat. He pulled directly into the empty rear parking lot of the Central Police Precinct, tightly clutching the heavy leather bag containing the stolen ledger, the digital storage drive, and his personal Olympus audio tapes. He marched briskly into the quiet station, loudly demanding an immediate audience with the lead investigator, fully intending to expose the entire illegal operation and the corrupt officials who had signed his original dispatch orders. But as he crossed the doorway threshold into the chief's private office, the dim room was eerily empty save for a single rusted desk, a mechanical clock ticking relentlessly on the wall, and a heavy manila folder marked Unresolved Narrative Inquiry. Incident 84B. Sitting quietly behind the wooden desk was an older officer, his withered face deeply shrouded in shadow as he carefully adjusted a vintage reel-to-reel tape recorder. The officer slowly raised his head, revealing the tired, hollow eyes of Senior Officer Thomas Vance. He did not look the least bit surprised to see Jonathan standing in the doorway. He merely reached out a calm hand and gently pressed the stop button on the spinning recording unit. "The report is officially complete, Jonathan," Vance said softly, his voice flat, emotionless, and carrying the exact, chilling acoustic inflection of the automated broadcasts from the subterranean vault. "Your tapes provided the missing frequency. The basin is quiet once again." Jonathan frantically reached into his bag, intending to pull out the concrete evidence, but as he unzipped the main compartment, he found only piles of empty, completely unspooled magnetic tape. The audio had vanished entirely, absorbed forever into the permanent archive of the shadow. If this file kept you awake tonight, leave a comment below with your thoughts, or share your own encounter. Until next time, pleasant nightmares.